Our first four lectures focused upon famous Greeks from the age of mythology, what in fact the Greeks believed to be real history, but which even they knew was as much legend as fact. We looked at Theseus, the traditional founder of Athens, and then at four famous Greeks of the age of the Trojan War: Achilles and Agamemnon, Hector and Odysseus, ennobled forever by the grand poetry of Homer. And we saw that the Trojan War was a real historical event, and that these figures, Agamemnon and Achilles, Hector and Odysseus, were real life and blood individuals. But the age in which they lived was 500 years before the time of Homer himself. Homer sang of the age of heroes, but his own age, the 8th century BC, was equally a time of great change, of tremendous innovation, an age of commercial and geographical expansion in which the foundation of classical Greece was laid. And the 8th century, the time of Homer, saw the emergence of the polis as the dominant political unit in the Greek world, the city-state. And in fact, we find that city-state described in the Odyssey in the Phaeacian state. King Alcinous and his capital city with its great walls and its surrounding territory, and also on the shield of Achilles in the Iliad, a polis is described. Not only its walls, but its characteristic features, such as the giving of justice by the community rather than the individual seeking vengeance. And yes, that warfare, which was a characteristic statement of the polis as well. The polis is traditionally translated in English by the city-state. It is a sovereign unit consisting of a walled city and then surrounding territory. There were, in the classical period, hundreds of city-states in the Greek world, stretching from the Black Sea all the way out to Sicily and as far away as Spain and what we would call France. Marseille today had its origin as a Greek polis. The polis could be carried around. It was portable. And so colonies were sent out from cities like Corinth, and Syracuse in Sicily was one of the many colonies that were sent out, becoming independent cities in their own right. The polis was fiercely autonomous. All of them were Greeks, and yet each city believed itself to be as independent as Britain or Belgium or France was traditionally. They had their own calendars, struck their own coins. All of them worshiped the Greek gods like Apollo and Zeus, but each had its traditional forms of cult. The polis was a political unit that rested upon the concept of communal or collective authority. Kingship passed away in the Greek world by the 8th and 7th century BC, and the polis rested upon the ideal that a number of citizens governed. In a polis in which a few governed, it might be called an oligarchy, ruled by the few. But the ultimate goal of a polis was to move towards democracy, government by all the citizens. Now, that citizen body tended to be exclusive. Only males were citizens, and for the reason that citizenship rested upon the obligation, the responsibility to serve in the military. And since women could not serve in the military, in the Greek view, they were not citizens. So the polis is the dominant political unit, and the most successful of all of the polis was Sparta. It was the most unusual as well, the most admired. Plato, for example, in his Republic, bases his ideal state on certain characteristics of Sparta. To the founders of our own country, there was far more to admire in Sparta than in Athens. And the institutions of Sparta, which made it so successful for so many centuries, from the 8th century BC right on down until the time of Alexander the Great, almost 500 years, a successful, powerful polis. The institutions that made Sparta so successful were attributed by the Spartans to their lawgiver, Lycurgus. And in this lecture and in the next, we want to look at the two lawgivers of the most important Greek city-states, Lycurgus of Sparta, and then in our next lecture, Solon of Athens. The lawgiver is a characteristic feature of Greek history in the 7th and 6th century. He is an individual who is generally chosen by his fellow citizens in a time of crisis to restore order to the country by giving them new laws. We find lawgivers in other nations. Confucius, for example, in China might be cited as an example. And Lycurgus was the most famous of all the lawgivers of early Greece. The Spartans themselves were not in agreement about when he lived. And the life of Lycurgus by Plutarch deals quite frankly with the difficulties in establishing a chronology for this great lawgiver. Aristotle, however, thought he had the answer. Aristotle found at Olympia, the site of the Olympic Games, a discus. And on that discus was inscribed Lycurgus and associated him with the beginning of the Olympic Games, in other words, with the year 776 BC. Now, Sparta lies deep in the south of the Peloponnese. It was one of the larger of the Greek city-states. Greek city-states vary enormously in their size. One, the city-state of Delos, was only 2.5 miles in distance. Others were 500, 600. Rhode Island, one of the smallest of our American states, would have been a large Greek city-state. And Sparta had more territory than most, well over 1,000 square miles. It was a land that was fertile by Greek standards, but in the time of Lycurgus, it had fallen into social chaos. And so Lycurgus was asked to undertake its reform. He himself was not of royal blood. His brother had been king and had died, and as the story went, Lycurgus was asked by his brother's wife, the queen, to marry her. She was at the very time expecting a child, and she told Lycurgus that if he wanted, she would get rid of the child, have an abortion. And Lycurgus put her off until the child was born, and then said, "He is now the legitimate king of Sparta." So the story is that he is a man of enormous integrity. And both Lycurgus and Solon set the model of nothing in excess and never to abuse power. Now, realizing that Sparta was in need of serious reform, Lycurgus set off on a series of travels and went first to Crete. Now, the Cretans were related to the Spartans. Both of them were Dorians. The Dorians had come into Greece after the fall of Mycenae, after the end of the civilization that had launched the Trojan War, probably around 1000 BC. They were Greeks, but they came from the northern part of Greece. They spoke a different dialect than the Athenians, for example. And Dorians had settled both in the land of Sparta, in Lacedaemonia, as well as in Crete. And Lycurgus studied the characteristic institutions of Crete, and then he went to Ionia, Asia Minor, where the Iliad was composed. And there he also studied their Greek institutions and compared the softness and love of luxury that characterized the Ionians, wearing their hair in artificial curls, wearing perfume, taking hot baths, with the rigorous, warlike society of Crete. He also went to Egypt, we are told, and noticed how the warriors were set apart from other elements in the society of Egypt, and then came back to Sparta to carry out his reforms. And those reforms rested upon achieving absolute equality among all Spartans. For the bane of the Greek city-state was civil war, and it was civil war brought about by economic and social disparity. And the goal of Lycurgus was to make every Spartan equal. He also wanted to establish a balanced constitution. And it was the balanced constitution of Sparta, attributed to Lycurgus, that was so admired by the founders of our country. Now, in antiquity, a balanced constitution is defined as follows. It is a constitution which balances in itself all the elements essential to government. And these the ancients believed were three: monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. Every government has the need for strong executive authority, in a time of crisis or warfare, for a single individual to be able to hold the reins of essential power. But there's also the need for a broad base of public support. That is democracy. And within that, there must be room for the guidance of the state by a small collection, of the best individuals. Aristocracy, this doesn't mean European nobility, but the best individuals, the best morally, the best intellectually. And Lycurgus sought to give the Spartans this kind of balanced constitution. The monarchical element, as he created the Spartan state, consisted always of two kings. There were two royal families, and these kings acted as checks upon one another. Now, at home, the king was fairly limited in his power. He had jurisdiction, for example, in the case of an heiress. He had jurisdiction over public roads. He was traditionally priest of certain divinities, such as Zeus. But his power was very limited. But in wartime, once the Spartans had declared war, he was absolute as commander-in-chief in the field. The democratic element was supplied by the assembly of all Spartans. And all Spartans came together to decide all issues of war and peace. All domestic and foreign policy issues were ultimately decided by the assembly of all Spartans. So it was a democracy in that the citizens were the ultimate sovereign, that power than which there was none greater. And then, for guidance, there was an aristocracy. The literary council of old men, the Gerousia, 28 members, the two kings plus 28 older Spartans. And they were chosen in what Aristotle said was a childish fashion. Judges would be locked up in a room with no windows, and the candidates would be paraded in front of the assembly of Spartans. And the judges inside would listen, have their little pads ready, and as candidate one went by, they couldn't see which candidate it was. The Spartans would beat on their shields with their spears. All right, sort of loud. Next one by. Oh, nice and loud. Third one, not much interest. Fourth one, he's the winner. And so he was chosen. And they then served for life in the Gerousia. And they particularly handled matters of foreign policy. And then there was one more element added after Lycurgus, the 5 ephors. Any Spartan could be elected as an ephor. 5 of them were chosen for each year. They served only a year. And they were the mediators between people and king. They promised to uphold the powers of the kings as long as the kings ruled in accordance with the ways of Sparta. And then this Gerousia could also act as a supreme court, so that if the assembly of Sparta passed a law that the Gerousia, the council of old men, regarded as unconstitutional, they could put it aside. And so it was a set of checks and balances, which the founders of our country thought, along with Rome, had been the best constitution devised by the ancients. And so looking at the powers of our president, the founders look back to the kings of Sparta. The Gerousia is literally embodied in our idea of a senate, with its Latin title meaning the assembly of the elderly, of old men. But Lycurgus, like our founders as a matter of fact, understood that even the best of constitutional institutions will not work over the long period unless the citizens who uphold that Constitution are vitalized by civic virtue. That is, the willingness of the individual to subordinate himself to the good of the community as a whole. And it was the civic virtue of Sparta and its citizens that so inspired the founders of our country. And Lycurgus believed that such civic virtue could only come about through education. Education was the key to instilling civic virtue. And that, in fact, was the goal of the entire Spartan constitution, civic virtue. We sometimes think of the Spartans as merely warlike machines carrying only about conquest. That is not true. Quite the opposite. They avoided war whenever possible. And the goal that they wanted were citizens who were dutiful to their country, reasoning, questioning, intelligent citizens. And this came about through starting at the very beginning of the child's life. In other Greek city-states, when a child was born, the father was the one to recognize the child as his own. And until the child had been recognized by the father, picked up and kissed by him, it was called a thing, an it, and had no real existence. And thus, if you didn't want the child, you could expose it without incurring blood guilt. But at Sparta, the ephors came, this body of 5 men, and they recognized the child as being a Spartan. And if he were in any way feeble or deformed, they cast him out to die. But if he were accepted as a Spartan, he was on the spot given, even as his little infant, a plot of land. And every Spartan had a plot of land that was tilled by slaves, helots. And then the child was raised at first by his mother until he reached the age of 7. And then at the age of 7, he joined with his band, it was called. Group of 12 or 15 to 18 boys who did everything in common. Eating in common, certainly learning the rules of warfare, training with weapons, but also learning to read and to write, learning poetry. And the Spartans were famous for their poems and for their dances, and already beginning to learn what made a good and useful citizen. And then at the age of 12, the boy left home. He joined up with his band permanently, and they slept together, sleeping under the most primitive of conditions, just a little group of rushes to lie upon and making their own blankets, never taking baths. The Spartans were convinced that hot baths destroyed you, so from time to time they would plunge into the cold water. Only one cloak to wear all year long, and never being fed enough food so that they would learn to be crafty and creep out into fields and seize what else they needed to fill them up. And then, at the age of 18, they graduated from their band. They had been carefully observed all along. And the Spartans believed that leisure was essential to a free man's life. And so the men came out constantly to watch the young boys training. They would watch the young boys at mealtime. They would question the young boys, saying, for example, who do you think is the best citizen in Sparta? Who do you think is the best man in Athens? What should our policy be towards Athens? So the boys grew to have a rounded view of the world. And then they went out on a mission at the age of 18, one that is condemned by Plutarch. But the helots were the state-owned slaves of Sparta. And the boy was sent out with nothing but a few rations and a dagger. And he was supposed to find and kill the largest, strongest helot he could find. It's cruel and brutal, but the idea was to give them a taste of blood before they went into battle. And then they became full-fledged members of the Spartan community. Now, it is characteristic of Sparta that the girls received the same education as the boys. And in Athens, for example, girls were kept secluded. The women were kept so secluded in Athenian society that women even spoke a slightly different dialect from the men. And when a girl in Athens got ready to marry, she'd be about 14. And her father and mother would pick for her a husband who might be 45 or 50. And he would have on his bookshelf, right next to his books on how to train a horse or a dog, how to train up your wife. Now, she might grow to have affection for him and respect for him, but romantic love was never in question. In Sparta, the girls received the same education, exercising in the nude right alongside the boys. And when they got ready to marry, it was a marriage based on romantic love. And in fact, the Spartans believed that everything should be dedicated to the community. So, a Spartan, for example, a young Spartan might go up to an older Spartan and say, "I have been observing your wife, and I think she is a wonderful woman. Would it be all right if we had a baby together?" And the husband would say, "Well, let me check with my wife. Yes, she would love to make a baby with you. Let's do so." Or the wife might come up to the husband and say, "I have been observing young Chylon there and think he would make a wonderful baby for us. Would you like to do it?" "Yes, go ahead, dear. Make a baby with him if he is willing." So a concept of adultery really did not exist in Sparta, because it was the purpose of the reforms of Lycurgus to make all Spartans equal. So they all owned the same plot of land, all had a set number of helots, and if a Spartan were out hunting and needed new dogs, for example, or needed some more javelins, he thought nothing of going into another Spartan's house and borrowing them and taking them. The women in Sparta were treated with the utmost respect, and the only person a Spartan ever called master was his own wife, and he always called her Despina, or my mistress. And she is the one who ran the farm. She is the one who disciplined the helots. Another destroyer of civic virtue in the mind of Lycurgus and the later Spartans was money. And there was no gold and silver allowed to Spartans. Whatever currency was needed was in the form of huge iron spits. So an enormous amount was needed to buy anything. So you couldn't hide your wealth. And it was believed that as soon as the Spartans began to use gold and silver, their constitution would vanish. The other thing that destroyed a country, Lycurgus believed, were lawyers. And there were no lawyers in Sparta because there were no written laws. Their laws were engraved upon their hearts. Their Spartan way of life, their rhetra. That was what made them so unique. And they didn't need lawyers to interpret it. It was based on honor and justice. And the honor of the Homeric heroes lived there in Sparta. Lived in the men as well as in the women. And one time, learning of how free the women were in Sparta, a foreign lady said, "It seems to me, that only in Sparta do the women run the men's lives." And the Spartan woman said, "That is because, madam, only in Sparta do the women bring forth men." The mothers were deeply proud of their sons. And when Spartans went off to battle, their mothers told them, "Come home with your shield or dead upon it." For the greatest shame was to throw away your shield and to leave your comrades unprotected on the field of battle. So this was the Spartan way. They had no luxuries. They did not believe in building fancy houses. And in fact, the collective existence was carried on even after you were an adult. And the men all came together in their private eating clubs, about 15 or 18 Spartans. And there they took all of their meals, and not even a king was exempt from sitting down and having these meals all together. And their favorite food was the black broth of Sparta. Heart and lungs, kidneys all chopped up together, sauteed with a bit of onion, tiny bit of red wine added. It was a food that only the Spartans could eat. And visitors coming there, having heard of the black broth, found it absolutely nauseating. But to the Spartans, it was the most glorious of foods, the same way that they used very little wine. And nothing was more disgusting than a drunken man in their view. So eating their black broth, drinking a tiny bit of wine mixed with water, they made their way back home without even a torch to light them. They frequently brought their sons to the eating clubs to show them the Spartan way and to pass on the values. And yet they were also not only civically virtuous, but the bravest, most feared warriors of Greece. For after all, to a Greek, to be a man was to be a warrior. And the ultimate statement of civic virtue was to serve your country on the field of battle. And the Spartans carried this to its utmost statement. Whenever the king marched into battle, he was always accompanied by an Olympic victor on either side. The Spartans knew that reputation is important, and they never entered Olympic Games unless they were pretty sure they were going to win the event. But on one occasion, a boxer entered from Sparta, and in fact had a very strong challenger from the city of Corinth. Always an ally of Sparta, but very different from the Spartans. Luxury-loving were the Corinthians. And there were merchants there from Corinth that had laid down very heavy bets on their local champion, the Corinthian boxer. And they approached the Spartan and they said, "Wouldn't you be willing to throw the match? We'll give you this much money." Spartan said, "No, I won't throw the match. We'll double that." "No." "We'll triple it." "No, I will not throw the match." And so he fought. It was a bloody, savage battle back and forth. And at the end, barely having won, all battered and broken, the Spartan staggered out of the ring, and the Corinthians came up to him and said, "So, Sir Spartan, what have you gained?" He said, "I have gained the right to fight beside my king." So honor and glory are there at the heart of the civic virtue of the Spartans. Sparta, in her the sword and spear do meet, and justice walks about her streets. For to the rest of the Greeks, no one was freer than a Spartan, and no one enjoyed more liberty, but it was a liberty under law, under discipline. And when the Persians came to invade Greece in the year 480, King Xerxes asked one who knew the Spartans well, "What makes these Spartans so fearsome? What makes them so brave? Why do you say that they can resist thousands of my own men? My men are as good a soldiers as they." And the man who knew the Spartans so well said, "Yes, King, but there is one thing that the Spartans revere even more than your subjects revere you, and that is their Spartan way of life." And it was this general admiration for the Spartans that made other Greeks freely join into an alliance with them. Sparta was at the head of an alliance, the Peloponnesian League, or in its traditional formula, the League of the Spartans and their allies, which could put some 60,000 men into the field. Great cities like Corinth, Sicyon, small little towns like Mycenae, Megara, were part of the Spartan alliance. Following the Spartans, having the same enemies as the Spartans did, and it was this that made the Spartans the most formidable military power in Greece. But it rested upon the respect for them and for their institutions. So these then were the constitution and the way of life which the Spartans attributed to Lycurgus. They believed that he had received a divine mission from Delphi to give them this constitution. And after his death, they brought him back. He had gone outside the city and starved himself to death, believing that he was too old to be of any further service and shouldn't consume any food. And so he died. They brought him back and worshiped him on the orders of the god Apollo from Delphi as a god. The Spartans alone among the Greeks buried their dead inside the sacred limits of the city. For death to them was no terror. It was but the natural conclusion of life. And so there they worshiped Lycurgus. Whether he is a man or a god, Delphi itself was not sure. But the institutions he gave them had endured. And so it would be that in the great crisis of Greece, 300 Spartans would make a stand at a place called Thermopylae, and there die to the last man. And on their tombstone was writ the proudest of words, "O stranger," for the Spartans called everyone who was not a Spartan a stranger, "O stranger, go tell the Spartans that we lie here, true even to the death, to our Spartan way of life." No city could be more different in its institutions than Athens was from Sparta, but both of them believed in civic virtue as the ultimate guide and support for a constitution. To Athens and to the reforms given it by Solon, we will turn in our next lecture.